Jujutsu Kaisen Modulo Chapter 7 is here, and this is the best chapter yet. Gege is absolutely in his bag. Let's get straight into our recap and review. Alright, so the chapter begins in the aftermath of Maru going absolutely berserk in the previous chapter, and Suduki kind of having to get in the way. So the curse user has actually escaped amidst this distraction, and we see him basically darting through back alleyways up until the point that he runs into Usami. And it's at this point that Usami reveals he has cursed speech by stripping off a glove, and underneath it we see the Inumaki claw and fang symbols, and then he tells the man don't move with cursed speech, and then proceeds to beat the brakes off of him, kicking him straight to the dome and knocking him unconscious. It's at this point that we cut back to Cross and Suduki, and Cross is livid. He's got Suduki by like the collar of his shirt, and he's like screaming at him. He says, "What did you just say?" Referring to how Suduki, pleaded out with Maru to like, let's be neighbors. And Suduki's like, I thought I wasn't supposed to talk to you. And Cross isn't having it. He's like, what did you say? Why did you use the word neighbors? And Suduki's like, that's what Maru said. Like, that's what you guys call it, right? He said, a neighbor is a friend who understands why the things that matter are so important to you. And Cross says, damn, Maru in his big mouth. And he just looks at Suduki and like launches into this monologue saying, you think we can be neighbors? Do you know your country's history? You've been living peacefully on a path laid out for you by a superpower ever since the war. What could you possibly understand about being our neighbor? You don't have to constantly think about protecting your own lives. You humans have everything you need to be human from the moment you're born. I'm sure you look down on refugees like us as being dangerous, filthy, and poor. And things have gotten especially bad ever since the Kyoto Paranormal Security Treaty established superiority for you amongst the international community. So even if you wanted to be neighbors, we would refuse. We then jump a little bit ahead in time because we see Usami arrive on the scene with Cross, and we see that the injured, Yuka, Suduki, and Maru are all being tended to by like medical professionals. Suduki is being loaded up in an ambulance, and Usami says, dispatch officer Cross, and Cross says acting minister Usami, and Cross says, I'd like to take Maru back to our mothership for him to be treated. Is that okay with you? And Usami says, or he thinks to himself, I don't want the Samorians to see Maru injured like this. Like, that'll be bad for our relations. And so out loud, Usami says, if he doesn't require any special treatment that only you Samorians can provide, I'd like to keep him here. We'll do everything we can for him. And Cross is like, no, we will be treating him ourselves. And Usami thinks, damn it, does he think that we want to collect biological information from Maru or something? And it's at this point that we see Cross walk up to his brother, who is unconscious on a stretcher, and he takes Maru's Band-Aid off of him and says, I'm going to borrow this for a little bit. We then cut to a Mahito jump scare. Yes, Mahito. There is this panel of him saying something to the effect of, damn it, it's not him. And I've seen several different translations of this moment, including this one where he says, what's all this? I thought you were him. Again, damn it, it's not him after all. And like, wait, you're not him. So something to that effect happens with Mahito in a panel like this. And then we just cut to Suduki jolting awake as if from a nightmare, implying that like he is the one who just saw Mahito and kind of had that little interaction. So he jolts awake in the hospital bed, and then he sees that Maru is in the room with him. And Maru is like, Suduki, are you okay? And Suduki is just immediately like, how is Yuka? And Maru says, she's getting checked out, but she seems fine. Suduki then apologizes to Maru and says, I'm sorry I accused you guys of plotting and barging into our turf. I was just being closed-minded, and I'm sure you guys have your reasons. He then says, but you used your curse technique back there, right? And you got hurt. Are you going to be punished for that? And Maru says, not yet. And Suduki says, I'm anxious. And it's at that point that Yuka barges into this hospital room as well. And Maru's like, Yuka! And Yuka says, I heard you were really amazing back there. I was asleep though, so I didn't see it. And Suduki says, he could pass for a grade 1 sorcerer easily. And Yuka says, for real? You show off. And then she goes, so, what should we do today? And Suduki says, yeah, I mean, I can move pretty fine, but what'd the doctor say? I can't believe you ran out of stamina so fast. And Maru is just kind of like watching them start to bicker and go back and forth. And Yuka says, I'm fine. I was just a little off my game. That's all. And Suduki says, well, all right, then let's go. And Maru says, go where? And they go, huh? The place you've been begging us to go, Maru. We then cut to the three of them at a carnival, and we see them riding a merry-go-round, a roller coaster, getting popcorn and different fair snacks. And then we see Maru think to himself, damn you, Maru, you never put this on your schedule. So this is our first real reveal that this is not Maru and hasn't been Maru. This is in fact Cross pretending to be his twin brother, which is why he took the Band-Aid earlier. So Yuka then says, it's just not enough, referring to the rides. And Suduki says, yeah, I want something faster. And Mino, who is also with them, Usami's subordinate, says, somebody's going to end up dead if they try and keep up with you two. We then see that a little kid carrying a balloon walks by them, and he accidentally lets go of it. And Cross just immediately grabs it and hands it back to the kid. And the kid says, hey, where's my mom? And they all just like lock in, and they're like, what? And Yuka says, oh, great, the cliche lost child. We probably shouldn't move him from this spot. Suduki, your face is too scary, so stop by the lost kid desk and then just disappear. And Suduki just takes off, and Mino takes off with him. He goes, I'll go too. So then Yuka kind of bends down to get eye to eye with this kid, and she says, your mom will come back soon if we wait here. And he just starts crying, and she goes, I guess that's not going to work. And so Cross just says, don't cry. What's there to cry about? It's not like your mom's dead. Just be quiet and be still. And then the kid just starts wailing even more. And Yuka looks at him and she goes, are you for real right now? And then Cross just does like a back handspring into a backflip. And he's holding popcorn, by the way. So he kind of like thrusts the popcorn up, does a backflip, lands, and catches the popcorn. And then like a bunch of people around see this and they're like, whoa, what was that? Does he work here? And then Yuka, not to be outdone, also does a backflip. And she goes, I can do that too, so don't get cocky. And he thinks to himself, what is her problem? It's at this point that the kid's mom comes back. So they're reunited and they're happy. And the kid actually hands his balloon to Cross, saying, thank you. And Yuka calls Suduki on their little technology device and says, hey, the kid's mom came back. And Cross is looking at this balloon that's a jack-o'-lantern and it says, Happy Halloween on it. And he goes, Halloween? And Yuka says, it's a holiday with Christian roots, but it was originally started by a different religion. And Cross says, Christianity? Is that the religion Earthlings follow? And Yuka says, nah, I think it's around 20 to 30% of the world, though. And she goes, and the Japanese are honestly kind of all over the place when it comes to religion. Basically, we follow Buddhism, Confucianism, and Shinto. But I guess we've also adopted more commercial holidays from other religions. And Cross says, so you don't have a god you believe in. And Yuka says, not sure on that one, but I personally don't at least. What about you, Cross? And Cross looks at her because she called him Cross, so his jig is kind of up. And she goes, yeah, it's totally obvious. Suduki might not have noticed yet, but even if he did, he probably wouldn't say anything. And Cross says, why not? And Yuka says, because he'd be mortified if he was wrong. He likes to remain cool at all times. Cross then says, we Samorians do have a god. And Yuka says, oh yeah? Have you heard about the story about trampling on tablets before? And he says, no. And Yuka says, well, back in the day, Christianity was forbidden in Japan. And to find out who believed in it, they'd take these tablets depicting Christ and tell people to trample on them. Anyone who refused to trample on the tablets was said to be a Christian and executed. But I just can't help but think, if I were a Christian, why couldn't I just still trample on the thing and then ask God for forgiveness afterwards? Because once you're dead, it's just all over. So, I mean, I can respect the fact that other cultures and religions value certain things, but sometimes it's hard to truly empathize with why they feel that way, Cross is silent for a moment, but then he says, let's say it wasn't a tablet, but a living thing. If it were alive, would you be able to trample on it still? And Yuka says, I see. I guess I never thought about it that way. And Cross says, so you finally understand. You and your brother are both shallow-minded. Humans like you have trampled on our way of life without even realizing it, sometimes by standing idly by and sometimes by outright stealing from us. And I'm not saying those who have been stolen from have the right to steal from others, but when you've been robbed, the temptation to steal in return lingers very strongly afterward. So you should be prepared for that. And Yuka thinks to herself, did he just declare war on us? Yuka thinks, I'll just pretend I didn't hear that. Then out loud she says, well, you know what? This is perfect timing. Come with me somewhere tomorrow and maybe you'll change your mind about that. And Cross just looks at her and says, where? And she says, to get my second opinion. We then cut to Yuka and Cross in a doctor's office the next day where a doctor seems to be explaining something to her about her brain. And we then cut to after this doctor's meeting where Yuka and Cross are just walking together. And he says, I couldn't really follow what he was saying. And she goes, I've never even heard of this illness before. And Cross says, so it's not cancer? I've heard that's common among Earthlings. And Yuka says, I don't know. Is a malignant tumor different from cancer? The problem is it's in my brain. I figured those headaches weren't normal, but still, only 6 months to live is pretty harsh. What is this, some low-budget drama? The least they could do is send some hot guy rushing to my bedside, you know? And Cross is just like, why did you bring me here? And Yuka says, because I hate going alone, and I don't want to be pitied. And Cross says, you know what? I'll be blunt. Even if you have 6 months left, your heart just died in this moment. No matter what you do, it'll never be moved like it was before. He continues and says, the things that made you smile, your favorite food, music, beautiful scenery, none of it will matter anymore. You'll just think, so what? I'm gonna die anyway. And from there, it's just an endless cycle of throwing away the precious time you have left into a swirling pool of hatred. Thinking, why did this happen to me? Why couldn't it have happened to them? And Yuka says, is that how it is with you? And Cross says, yes. You've had your future stolen from you too, Yuka Akutsu. And Yuka says, so then what will you do, Cross? Steal even more from those who have been stolen from? And Cross gets mad and he says, don't compare yourself to us. We suffered a man-made disaster, not some illness or unfortunate accident. And Yuka says, sure, but you said I had my future stolen from me too. She continues and says, maybe you lost your home, but you're not gonna die. I'm gonna die. And Cross says, you think you're going to change my mind because you won in the contest of bad luck? And Yuka says, that's not what I mean. I mean, why jump to conclusions? I can't change my situation, but with time, you can change yours. It's okay to be pissed about how unfair it is, and it's okay not to forget it. But tell me what happened to you and your people, because we are not your enemies. And Cross just says, that's idealistic nonsense. You're standing safely on the opposite shore, yet you really think I can accept your righteous arguments? He continues and says, you all keep going on about coexisting, but what you really mean is to live here on Earth without causing you any trouble, right? But for how long? How long do we have to check our behavior for Earthlings? If we have to spend years, decades even, living such a miserable existence, then I will steal. But Yuka just looks at him calmly and says, how long will you steal for? And that just kind of catches him off guard and he doesn't know what to say. And she says, hating people and stealing from them is easy. That's why it becomes an endless cycle. And then she kind of turns to him and just says, let's put an end to that, Cross. And that's where the chapter ends. What a chapter. And I know that was an in-depth recap, but there was just so much important stuff in that dialogue that I really just wanted to hit all of it. But man, so many different things to kind of latch onto in this chapter. First and foremost, Mahito, right? And I already put out a video kind of explaining my thoughts on this, and I might make another video now that I've had a little bit more time for it to kind of marinate. But y'all check out that video if you haven't. My main thought process here is that this is Mahito in the kind of in-between life and death place, the same place we saw him speak with Sukuna at the end. So to me, it's still him hanging out in that like cursed realm and not necessarily indicative that he's reincarnated. And it seems as if he's waiting for Yuji to die, the same way he spoke with Sukuna when Sukuna died. Now, whether that means he's just waiting for one final conversation with Yuji, or if he's got something else planned, maybe a potential comeback, we'll have to see. And man, come on, Yuka with the brain tumor. Gege Akutami, why do you hate us so much, okay? What a freaking gut punch. Like, you know, are we just setting up for inevitable tragedy here? We also have Suduki, you know, with his heavenly restriction, as Maki put it, you get stronger through loss. Like, is this setting up for something in that regard, I don't know. I'm kind of hoping for a more optimistic and different outcome this time around. Like, maybe something can be done about this. Specifically, the Simurians might have more advanced medical technology, like maybe they'll be able to do something. I don't know, but devastating. And then there were just so many interesting things that Cross said this chapter that kind of shines a little bit of light on the alien situation, but not fully, right? Talking to Suduki at the start of the chapter, being like, you guys have it on Easy Street. You just are born with everything you need to be human, right? What does he mean by that? Is that purely just a reference to like the fact that they've lost their homeworld and lost a big piece of themselves? Or is there some like thing that we don't understand about the aliens yet that makes life in general for them way more difficult compared to a human, right? And then when he's talking about what happened on his homeworld, he said it was a man-made disaster. What does he mean by the word man there? Is he referring to his own species or specifically humans? Because it certainly feels like there's some emotional baggage there which could imply a deeper history with humans than we're even aware of, right? And even his language at the very end of the chapter where he was like, you and I have always stood on different shores, except now we're on the same shore. Well, that implies that, even prior to them coming to Earth, they were familiar with them. And they're like, oh, humans have it so easy with how they've been doing things compared to us Simurians who've had to live this way. Now, that is conjecture on my part, but I think it would make sense. But it is at least possible that Cross is only just upset based on everything that's happened since they've come to Earth. But it feels like there's a deeper history there we're not yet aware of. In any case, like I said, best chapter yet. Gege is absolutely cooking. I love the dynamics he's exploring here, and I love the dynamic that's been set up with these sibling pairings now, because we have Suduki and Maru who have kind of become a pair, and now I think we'll have Cross and Yuka become a pair. And I'm just so interested to dive deeper into all of these things. And I do have more thoughts on some certain aspects here, but I think I might make separate videos across the next week while we wait for the next chapter to talk about some of those things more in depth, because we're already getting pretty long here. So if you made it this far, thank you so much for watching, and please let me know all of your thoughts and theories and interpretations down in the comments below. Or as always, come join us in the Discord where we got people talking about these things 24/7. We would love to have you there.